Welcome to a new episode of Media Capital. Today we have Singari Seshadri, is an investor, operator, and entrepreneur with deep experience launching and scaling consumer businesses. She incubated Cumulus Media, now the second largest radio operator in the US, led innovation at Nike, sold entrepreneurship at Stanford, and invested across media, health, and wellness. She's now focused on women's sports, where she brings a unique lens shaped by years in VC, startup, and corporate leadership. And on today's episode, we're discussing how media and capital are reshaping women's sports and the economic realities facing female athletes. Singari, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. We've been planning this for a while, and I'm so glad that we're making this happen.
Diana, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to connect with you as well. I love what you're doing. You're innovating in the media space and in the venture space. So excited to jump into the conversation. Thanks again for having me.
Absolutely. And we have quite a few topics to talk about. First, I want to hear your story because you have a very interesting story of how you came to the US, your early ventures, and then moving on to Stanford and Nike. But first, how did you find yourself at the intersection of media and venture capital?
I would say completely by accident. I grew up in India, came to the United States as a immigrant graduate student many moons ago. And while in grad school, looking for part-time jobs, I stumbled into venture capital, knew nothing about it, had barely heard about it. This was in Wisconsin. So I started working for a boutique media venture capital firm while I was in grad school and then joined them full-time after I graduated. And my first deal happened to be in the radio broadcasting business. You mentioned Cumulus Media, but the venture firm was somewhat unusual in that they incubated this company, starting with one radio station. It was the brainchild of the founders of the company. They started with one radio station. We acquired over 300 radio stations over 2 years, took the company public. It was why I started the digital business. It was a interesting and amazing experience. I learned a lot about the media business, about venture capital, about acquisitions, about taking companies public. Also learned a lot about culture, leadership, and lots of aspects of working with people and small businesses. So it was a wild experience. So that's what put me front and center with media and investment. That certainly was not something that was very intentionally planned or something that I sought after. Stumbled into it, absolutely loved it, and very grateful for the experience.
But it seems like it is a trend in a way that I think stayed with you over the years, and we'll go through that further. Nike and arguably some of these largest consumer brands these days are, in of itself, media platforms. I'm curious, just on Cumulus Media, obviously right now is one of the largest, second largest actually radio operator in the US. Are there any lessons you remember from those early days that you think still apply today in terms of traditional media, perhaps monetization? Obviously, Cumulus, they grew by acquiring, right, all the local stations. But yeah, curious if there are any early learnings that you think they still apply today in this digital
Yeah,
first world.
yeah. It's interesting you raised that question because the experience there came to mind so often when I was at Nike and their innovation group, because one of the things that we did at Cumulus, or we attempted to do, was we started out in the radio business, went and acquired, built this amazing radio company, but then we're also looking at how do we monetize those assets and how do we expand from more traditional media to digital media and the sort of convergence of digital, traditional, and all of those things. But it was hard to take a traditional company and have it look forward and invest in more futuristic things that were still emerging. Streaming at that point was still just emerging, but we were thinking about the consumer 5, 10 years ahead and thinking about where is media going to go. But the company found it hard, company and company leadership found it hard to leapfrog. And that's a classic innovator's dilemma, challenges that I faced at Nike as well in the digital innovation group, where you had this very successful company that was in the footwear and apparel and sports space. We were trying to think ahead to where should Nike play in digital? And so you run into this conflict, which many academics and great leaders have written about corporate innovation and the innovator's dilemma. Where do you invest and double down on the core business versus something that's more innovative or disruptive and that might need more time to mature and emerge? But I feel like I ran into it at Nike of see it every day with other companies as well, where it's this balance you have to play between this is my core business, but I also need to innovate and disrupt. I think with media in particular, at the end of the day, media is content. And it's different forms of content, whether it's audio, or video, or words, or images. And we've seen such an evolution in how content is created, how content is distributed, and primarily how consumers are consuming content. And I think the two big changes we're seeing is that content and media is not necessarily being produced in a single place or in these large companies, right? You now have the influencer or creator economy where we're all content producers and we're all creating all types of content. And at the same time, you have users who are consuming content in all these different ways. I think that's one big evolution that we've seen, which has obviously impacted companies like TV, every movie industry, every industry has been disrupted. Every media industry has been disrupted by that. And so I think that's a bit of an evolution. And then I think the other side of it is, and this is not just for the media industry, we're seeing this in healthcare, we're seeing this in other industries where there's this desire for highly personalized content. Back in the traditional radio business, you were beholden to whatever the radio station was playing. So you chose your radio station based on a genre, but within that, it was like up to the DJ to decide what your playlist is. And this is part of why the radio business got disrupted and why Spotify is doing so well, because we want to be our own DJs. We want to curate our own lists. We want to be able to pick and choose. So I think it's been really interesting to see the evolution of this. And I think, as you said, every brand has had to adapt to that. And I think the brands that have adapted and have been able to leverage media in a innovative way are the ones that have been and will continue to be successful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's the time horizons as well, isn't it? How do you balance that short-term revenue that comes from your core business to trying to invest or innovate in H2, H3 horizons? And yeah, you also touched essentially on the fact that owning distribution, right? It's very important, especially in this moment where everything is basically democratized and everybody can start creating content. But also the monetization of these platforms is really important as well. So you can't just simply rely on ad revenue anymore, especially as a traditional media business, and going to events, syndication, sponsorship, etc. is very important. I'm curious, Cumulus Media, and in between, there's been a few funds that you've been part of, and you're also actually working on a very exciting fund right now. How did you make that leap forward and even further into venture? Has there been a defining moment, basically, in
Yeah,
your career that shaped that approach?
it's interesting. I was actually just having a conversation with my son a couple of days ago about career paths and these linear career paths where you join a company or an industry and you just move up the ladder in the same company or industry, or careers like mine, which have been a complete zigzag and, what I call jumping from one stepping stone to another. Actually, just to rewind for a minute, before I joined Questus, the media venture capital company, I had another job offer with a very well established, large, traditional corporate company. And I had choose between the two. And for various reasons, I chose the small boutique firm, but it's one of those what if moments of if I had gone down the corporate path early on, I probably would have just maybe, I don't know what I would have done, but maybe just climbed the ladder. But I look back and there used to be these moments early in my career where I'd be like, I really should have done that because I've found myself in lots of transition moments where I've had to either reinvent myself or go do something different or start something entrepreneurial. And it was frustrating and difficult, and I would second guess myself a lot. But now I look back and I'm so grateful for all the opportunities that I've had where I've been able to do lots of different things. They're all interestingly connected to early stage entrepreneurship and venture. So just to take you through a quick chronology, After my stint in media, in the media venture space, I moved to another venture firm based in New York, where we were investing in the early days of the content industry in the startup space. So it was sort of media, but in a different flavor of it. Also, we also some fintech, privacy, and lots of interesting deals like that, but stayed in traditional early stage venture. I then took a pivot, tried to start an incubator for women entrepreneurs, which morphed into more of a social venture, helping women who had taken a break from their careers come back to work by starting their own businesses. So that was an interesting few years. My family and I then moved to the Bay Area. I stumbled into another role, which was at Stanford, helping students start their own businesses. I ran Stanford Venture Studio, which is the largest incubator at campus, and then went on to Nike and did innovation there, ran their internal incubator. I wish I could say these were all very intentional career moves, but if there's one word I can use to describe like how these opportunities all came about, it's serendipity. The Nike opportunity just came out of nowhere and looked interesting, went after it, got it. Stanford was, I started to do volunteer coaching, and before I knew it, I was running a program. It's not that they've been on where I've used intention is to, if an opportunity comes my way, think about, hey, is this something that I want to do? I think this transition, I left Nike a few months ago. I've been transitioning into a couple of new roles in the last few months. And this has been probably the most intentional part of my life and my career, where I've really spent time thinking about what is it that I want to do? What was it that I want to spend my time on? I wrote this on LinkedIn, but people and purpose are what driving my choices now. Is who do I want to work with? Who do I want to surround myself with? Who do I want to serve as a consumer, as a user? How do I want to go do that? And given my experience in incubating businesses, building businesses, and venture, what I'm trying to do is use that to have the impact in spaces that I care deeply about. And those are two very interrelated ones. It's broadly the health and well-being of people, but women in particular. And then within that, women athletes. And when I talk about health and well-being, we tend to think about health in a very one-dimensional way, where it's physical health, medical health, but being healthy actually means having a healthy career, however that might be defined, having healthy relationships, being mentally healthy, being physically healthy, having healthy relationships. So there's a whole spectrum of being healthy. And that's my area of focus now from an investment perspective. I'm doing that as a partner in a firm called IKJ, which is a healthcare venture fund. And then I'm trying to create a little pillar within their portfolio.
Would it be too early to ask about the thesis or what you're looking for in the fund?
It's not too early, but maybe the way I articulate it may not be as eloquent or well defined as it should be. It's literally something I was working on even last night. I think at the core of it, I care about improving the lives of women and women athletes. So I'll break it into two things. There's the women's health piece of it, health and well-being. And within that, a subset of a consumer group that I care about is women athletes. On the more holistic women's health and well-being, you asked about a transformational moment in my life. I think my pivot into women's health really came from my own personal journey, where a few years ago I had a pretty major medical scare, and it led me down into this rabbit hole of seeing, I don't know, 40 different doctors, doing a lot of Google research. This was even before ChatGPT. Thankfully, because I think ChatGPT would have really confused me even more. But you never want to have these moments where you're sitting in front of a doctor and they're like, that's interesting. I'm not sure what's going on. You don't want your doctor saying that to you. But what it made me realize is how, while healthcare and health research has been around for so long, there's still so little we know, particularly about women's bodies and how women uniquely deal with certain diseases and conditions. And my passion and interest in investing in women's health and well-being really comes from, let's make sure we are investing in understanding women's health systems better, providing access to healthcare for all women, making sure women and women of color and people of color are included in research and in the data that's now informing. ChatGPT is our favorite doctor now. So let's make sure ChatGPT knows about women and women of color and South Asian women like me, so that if I ask it a question, it's actually giving me the right answer. So that's one piece of it. Within that well-being piece of it, I got to really understand the lives and needs of women athletes during my time at Nike. And one thing that really stood out to me is the commitment that these women make when they choose to become professional athletes, and the trade-offs and sacrifices that they have to make to be athletes, particularly on the financial side of things. We're seeing tremendous momentum and investment in sports and in women's sports in particular. And I'm so excited and delighted for that. And I know we will continue to see that momentum, but there's still a huge gap in how much of that money is trickling down into the hands of women athletes, particularly to set them up for success in the long term. So that's another thesis that I'm investing in, is to say, can we improve the lives and well-being of athletes from a financial perspective? Can we help them get more money in their pocket today? But what I'm really interested in is this idea of long-term wealth creation and long-term well-being, so that when they retire, they're not starting over, and they're not starting over with zero, which is what's happening today with a lot of athletes. And the reason it all
Yeah.
ties nicely together is there's research that shows, and we heard this from athletes at Nike, that financial insecurity and career insecurity is the number one stressor for athletes. That's the thing that stresses them out the most. Yes, obviously they care about winning and performance on the field and everything, but this is their life. They've committed to it, and they leave everything on the field or the track or whatever platform they're playing on. But the sacrifices that they make off the field are pretty tremendous.
I was listening to you, Singari, and I couldn't agree more. We actually had an event in San Francisco around consumer sports entertainment 3 weeks ago. We had a women basketball professional player. She was a basketball professional player, and she was talking about the same challenges, and so many other people working in venture talk about the same challenges. A lot of women athletes, actually, they go on and having to work right outside of season, or they're trying to take on different sponsorships in order to survive. And I don't even want to go into comparing, I don't know, WNBA players with NBA players, because it's literally a fraction of the earnings that you would
Yeah.
find in typical NBA.
Can I just make a comment on that? Yes, if we compare women and male athletes, the numbers are just staggering. But it's really not even a comparison. Yes, someday we want gender parity, and there is gender pay parity in some sports, thanks to people like Billie Jean King, and tennis players are paid equally. In other sports, and this is very relevant to the media business, part of the disparity we see between the men and women's sports is because of broadcasting deals, media deals, sponsorship. And I think we will reach that point. So it's not necessarily, oh, all women should be paid the same. What I'm really focused on is, can we just get greater access for women to, whether it's sponsorship deals or business ownership opportunities, equity ownership opportunities. Let's get creative of how the women's sports ecosystem and industry is being operated, and not try to say it needs to be the same as men, because it's not. It's similar, but it's quite different as well. And there is a ton of sponsorship money going into women's sports too. I think it's amazing that it's seeing its moment, it's being recognized for its value. People are watching, viewership is in record numbers, both online and offline. The sponsorships and endorsements are still a small percentage of what the athletes make, and still, unfortunately, somewhat reserved for the top athletes, which makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, what I'm trying to do is really democratize that access and help athletes up and down the roster. And
Yeah.
as I always say, like, in 10 years, if this problem doesn't exist, like, that's great. If whatever venture I start is out of business in 10 years or 5 years, even because the problem doesn't exist, I'll be the happiest person.
It's definitely a very timely thesis, but also equally, and I think you talked about this before, and it's the same, I guess, in venture, right? What can we do, or what do you think needs to be done to build a more inclusive venture ecosystem, and also around women's sports as well? Obviously, funds like what you're building, absolutely. But there's so many other players that have to come together at the table.
Yeah, it's really an ecosystem approach. And what's interesting is you brought up the venture capital space. And part of what got me interested and a lot of where I'm trying to ideate is take what I've learned about venture, the startup space, and see if it can be applied to the women's sports industry. And what I mean by that is, as you pointed out, there's huge disparities in the venture capital space around funding to women-led startups, even how much venture capital is controlled by women in leadership positions. But we've seen great progress, very slow, but progress made in those spaces where, because we have more women venture capitalists, because we have more women as GPs and funds, more women in check writing capacity, we are seeing more funding going to women-led founders. And that is a snowball effect where the more funding that goes to women-led founders, there are more women who are going to be motivated to start businesses. Because I think we did some research on this at Stanford, where it's a lot of about if you continue to look at an industry and you say, oh, women only get 2% of venture capital. It's so hard to start a business as a woman founder. If you're a young woman thinking about starting a business, you're going to look at that and go like, why would I do that? It's so difficult unless you're really driven to it. So we need more women starting businesses, becoming successful. We now have women-led unicorns. We have women-led companies that have gone public. So we need more of that momentum to keep building that snowball into an avalanche. It's much slower than we all want it to be. And I think
Yeah.
there's still stigma and bias around women-led startups. And we're seeing this in a big way in women's health investments. I was recently on a panel around investing in women's health companies. And one of the comments that was made is that majority of women's health companies are still started by women. And that makes sense, right? We understand the pain point, and so more women tend to start women's health companies. But the investment is also mostly coming from women VCs. And that's also good and interesting, but we need men starting and investing women's health companies, and we need everybody looking at women's health as a common
Yeah.
sector as opposed to this is just reserved for women. In the same way, I think we in the sports industry, we're now seeing that it's not a niche, right? It's part of the sports industry. Women's sports is very much mainstream. We've seen the biggest investors and well-established funds putting money into it. And so we need more of that momentum to continue to amplify the message that it's not a niche, it's not a nice to have. You shouldn't be investing in women's sports because it's the right thing to do and because it's for women. It's because it's a solid business. It's a really great business opportunity. The growth projections are amazing. We should be investing in it because it's a fantastic business opportunity. And I think you're starting to see that message.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think I've seen, I mean, some of, I guess, the most successful femtech companies, if you like, I actually started by men. I think of Flow Health, for example, right now, which is definitely a unicorn. And there's others, I think also hardware. And I think men, whether they've seen experiences through their wives, sisters, mothers, they start to understand. And there is a lot more momentum in the space. I think on the sports side, I'm curious, where do you see the opportunity in terms of investing? Where is the biggest opportunity? Is it obviously media rights? It's a very attractive space, but is it fan engagement? Is it tech platforms? What are you
Yeah.
looking at?
So what I'm interested in is investing in the ecosystem. So I'm focused one on the athlete. So where are the needs and the gaps of the athletes themselves personally? And then where do we invest in the ecosystem that then actually helps improve the lives of athletes as well? And I think there are a couple of opportunity areas that I'm particularly excited about. One is what I talked about before, where how can we help athletes feel more financially empowered, financially secure, so that they can give 110% to their sport. They're already doing that, but they're doing that under very stressful financial condition. So how do we alleviate some of that stress? And there's a whole world of products and services that already exist and that I'm excited to incubate and invest in. There's one that I'm incubating right now that maybe I'll share later on or on another episode. I can give you a little sneak peek, but it's really about helping athletes leverage entrepreneurship as a career pathway and build businesses, own businesses, build equities. So it's back to my entrepreneurship core and helping athletes become founders. The other part of it is what you talked about, which is fan engagement. I think fans are engaging with women's sports in ways that I think it even blows through all the projections that were made a couple of years ago. Every year, the projections that were made, the numbers are just blowing through the roof. We've seen this hockey stick in terms of fan engagement with women's sports, which is fantastic. And I think it will continue to grow that way. That said, I think there is opportunity to start to widen that circle of who the fan is. We started out with kind of I'll call it the early adopters, the people that were women's sports fans already and were women's sports fans when women's sports wasn't even an industry. And then now we've seen it grow to people who are curious about what's going on, who are coming out to games because their daughters want them to go, or because their sons want them to take them, or because they're just interested in building up their local teams and in supporting the momentum. But we need to expand that. And I think we need to redefine what fan engagement also means, right? Today, fan engagement is I show up to a game, I buy merch, I watch the thing on TV. Not everybody is going to get to that point. So there's going to be people who maybe go to one game because it's a local game or maybe buy one piece. So how do I engage with people who are in that maybe more of the outer circle so I can ultimately it's about monetization, monetize them too. At Nike, we used to think a lot about loyalty and rewards, and we talked about it on a spectrum of 0 to 4, right? 4 are the like loyalists, they're buying Nike every day, they're fully engaging, and 0 are the people who are never engaging with Nike. And it wasn't necessarily about getting the 0s to the 4s, but getting the 0s to the 1s to the 2s, and then keeping the 3s and 4s happy. I've been thinking about women's sports and fan engagement in that spectrum. And I think there's some interesting companies, especially with the use of AI now. And some of the teams are doing a really great job around this as well, especially locally here in the Bay Area. The Valkyries and Bay FC have done a fantastic job of fan engagement. New York Liberty does a great job. Angel City does a great job. And other teams are learning from them as well. I think the third area that I am most excited about probably is actually investing in more teams and leagues and really growing the ecosystem. There's a lot of money going in and it's a growing industry, but if you think about it, it's still pretty small. The number of WNBA teams we have is still tiny. It's under 20 and it's expanding, but it's still tiny. Same with NWSL. And you're starting to see new leagues pop up in this 2 new basketball leagues, there's 2 new soccer leagues. So you're starting to see these, but they're all still startups if you think about it. And so we need more investment to grow the business and the scale of the women's sports industry to a point where it can actually be accessible to more people. It ties back to fan engagement. If you only have a dozen teams playing in a dozen cities, you're leaving out a huge swath of the country that maybe doesn't have a local team that they can go engage with. So I'm really excited to both personally and invest and grow the ecosystem, but also see more investment coming in to growing more teams and more leagues into more sports as well. Today, basketball and soccer and maybe volleyball and tennis are getting a lot of attention. But there's some fantastic sports beyond that. Track and field is seeing some attention now, but I'd love to see some more under the radar sports start to get more investment and structure as well.
Absolutely. I was actually writing a lot of notes. I have several interesting people that I would love to connect you with.
I was going to say, I think you and I talked about this briefly, but as one of the things that I'd love to maybe hear about and even think through is as you think about innovating and using media as a currency and media for capital, media plays such a huge role in the sports industry. So I think there's something there to be unlocked as well.
Absolutely. There's synergies. We were looking into some of these platforms. Some are more mainstream, trying to educate and support girls from an early age, and not only
Hmm.
getting into
Hmm.
sports, but majority have obviously a sport angle, which I would love to share with you. And I think this is where, if I think about TV or above the line media, rich media, right? That's where you can have a very positive impact. But also equally in terms of fan engagement, there's many interesting technologies out there. We've been looking at some here in the US as well as Europe, which allow fans essentially to invest, to support athletes and be vested in their future success. So sports for us and wellness is a growing vertical, and I think it's starting to define what we do at MFG. And yeah, I would love to share some of these examples with you. And Singari, we have a section of the episode where we call it a shout out. And this is somebody that had an impact on your career or even yourself personally. And I know it's always very challenging to choose one person, but if there's somebody that you like to give a shout out to, who would that be and why?
I was thinking about this earlier, and as you said, it's hard for me to pick one person because I talked about the serendipity in my career path, and that serendipity is really tied to people, right? There's people who took a chance on me, there's people who mentored me, there's people who shaped me to become the leader that I am today. There's people who've inspired me to be entrepreneurial, who've supported me when I was like down and hit rock bottom. So lots of people who've had an impact on me. I think if I had to pick to the one person that I think I realize now had a profound impact on me, but maybe I didn't realize it at the time, is my mother. She was an entrepreneur, started a business when I was a year old against a lot of odds. This was in India in the basement of our home. So I grew up in a family business, and fierce and fearless, and was a huge supporter of other artists. She was an artist herself, huge supporter of women, but did it in her own sort of quiet, courageous way without a lot of hoopla or attention. And I think I now realize that the entrepreneurial DNA that I have is probably from her. Unfortunately, she passed away a couple of decades ago, and growing up with her and actually even losing her actually has been a huge inspiration for me in a lot of what I do. So I think from an impact perspective, she's someone that's had a huge influence in my life, knowingly and unknowingly as well. I think if I had to pick another person, it would be my first boss in venture, Richard Weening, who took a chance on me, took a chance on this immigrant student from India who knew nothing about venture capital, and really took me under his wing and taught me everything I know in venture. And as I said, in this what if moments, it put me on this trajectory that I don't know that I would have even chosen for myself if I had thought about it. So I think game changing or transformational would have been that moment.
It was very emotional to hear about the impact that your mom had on you. And this probably question always comes up. Is entrepreneurship something that can be taught or is it innate? And I mean, it's a huge debate, right? But I think what you're saying is it is something that I think it is part of the DNA, who you are.
I've certainly had this debate and thought a lot about it, especially during my stint at Stanford, because what we did at Stanford was teach students entrepreneurship. And we talked a lot about, can everybody be an entrepreneur? Can anybody be an entrepreneur? And we liked to think so at Stanford. The way I think about it is it's less about, are you born with it or not? It's, is it right for you? And that answer may be different at different stages in your life too. You might be more willing to be entrepreneurial and jump into it at certain stages in your life versus not. And so I think it's more about, is this the right path for you? I'm biased, but I strongly believe that everybody should try their hand at entrepreneurship in some way. And I also want to put it out that being entrepreneurial or being an entrepreneur doesn't mean starting a Silicon Valley venture funded tech business. There's lots of ways you can be an entrepreneur and entrepreneurial that doesn't involve starting a VC funded business. And I think we're all entrepreneurial in some way. It's more about how do we exercise that? How do we manifest that? How do we bring that into our lives. But I do think that there's a certain time, place, person, and certain traits you need to take that leap to start a business, grow a business, go through all the pivots, fail, get back up. Whether those can be developed or not, I guess, is the big debate. You certainly can learn the frameworks and the theory of entrepreneurship very well, and schools like Stanford do it in an amazing way.
I agree. And I guess ironically, in a way, I did study when I was at UCL. I did study actually the whole
Yeah.
master degree was around technology entrepreneurship. And I come from an operator background. So very similar to what you described. Yeah, it's interesting where life takes you. Never necessarily thought of ending up in a very niche space that we call media capitals. That's how it works. There's so many projects that you were involved in. I was thinking of how to phrase this question because it is a very broad question, and I think you can answer it in many different ways. And you can answer maybe professionally as well as personally. What formed you as a person, as Singari? Are there any top learnings that you took from all the different ventures that you've had over the years?
Lots of learnings. And I think this goes back to what I said before, where at one point I would look back on my zigzag career and go, who are you thinking, Sigari? What kind of career is this? But I think you get older, you get wiser, and you learn to reflect. And it's the learnings that have shaped me. I've had such a tremendous opportunity to learn different things in different roles that I've had. I think my top learning is probably the importance of relationships and investing in the people around you and building those strong relationships. And I think about it as relationships with the people who you work for, the people you work with, the people who work for you, and the circles beyond that. And I think having those strong relationships and really being empathetic and understanding the give and take that exists in every relationship is so important, because surrounding yourself with people who have your back and that you have their back is what helps you succeed, whether it's within that particular job you're doing or in your career or beyond. From a power perspective, one of the things I learned, both in a good way and the hard way, at my job at Nike and also at Stanford and in venture and probably in every role, is there's always the people with the power and the people maybe not without or maybe with less power, and figuring out where that power and influence lies and whatever you're trying to accomplish is so important. And it's often not where you think it is. It's often not in the hierarchy of where you think it is. Like, in take corporate as an example, one would think that the top of the ladder is where the power lies. And often it's maybe two rungs down and two steps to the left, where there's this very influential person who whispers something in the ear of somebody else. And you need to figure out who that person is, build a relationship, build the trust so you can get what you want. And so I think people and relationships has been something that I've learned over time, is something that I invest in a lot, and I think of it as my currency in all ways. I think the two other things that have been more recent learnings, especially in the last couple of months as I've yet another pivot and transition in my career, is so important to have a North Star to guide you. Where do you really want to go? What's your goal? I was talking to my son about this too. And it doesn't have to be something clearly defined, like I want to be this title at this company. It could be, but it could also
Yeah.
be, this is what's important to me, and this is what I want to guide the decisions I make. And trust me, if I had that 20 years ago, it wouldn't be what I'm doing today. And maybe it would have changed a million times, and that's okay. But at least it gives you something to ground on, and you can check back in and say, oh, am I still headed in that direction? And if I'm not, why is that? And maybe I like this other direction better, but having some direction, I think it just grounds you. I didn't have
Yeah.
that for a long time. I was just bouncing around the place, and I feel like I have that more now. And then the other thing, and a lot of this has been informed by my personal journey, is life is short and unpredictable. And we live in this, oh my God, ever changing, unpredictable, stressful world where
Yeah.
there's so much going around us that things can change in a moment. So live each day to the fullest and prioritize well being. prioritize health and well-being. I didn't do that early in my life. So that would be my tell my 20-year-old self is exercise more, think about your health, think about your well-being, because you cannot take it for granted, no matter what age you are.
I completely agree. And I think it's maybe because, and I feel the same, and maybe it's also because of the industries in which we operate. I think both the sports and media are fast changing with good or bad.
And venture.
And venture.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting you mentioned relationship. I think venture capital cannot be more relationship driven. It's so relationship focused. And I like how you talked about power formerly and even now, obviously, we're dealing with large corporates. And I always like to think about people inside corporations, especially if you think about making the case for what you do or for a project. There's always three type of people. You've got the influencer, you've got the decision maker, and then you've got the user, essentially, who's going to be using or translating that project into something tangible. So how you navigate that is really what in the end is going to make it probably happen. But they're very different people.
If we go back to the conversation we were having about women in venture, women's sports, women's health, a lot of that, the reality of it is, and again, this is changing and in a very positive way. But if we take your metric of influencer versus decision maker or some level of power and influence, there still is a majority of power and influence today in a lot of sectors still lies with men. And so I think, yes, we need to change that, but rather than fight it, how do we make sure we are bringing them into the conversation, having those people with power, influence, decision making participate in investing in the industries where we need to bring more dollars in. And that's what we're seeing in women's sports, which is
Yeah.
fantastic. We're seeing a lot of really great men and women put money into the industry. And so those are the types of changes we need to continue to see. And it's not just a women's thing. It's not just a women's fight.
Singari, I have a last section. We're coming to the end. And you mentioned before when you were describing your thesis, would definitely love to have you back on the show and talk about in a year from now how the fund has been progressing and the thesis has been changing. You already alluded to that first one. What advice would you give to your younger self? And I think you mentioned exercising more. I completely agree to that. Do you have a favorite sport, by the way, either that you practice or you follow?
Yeah, my favorite sport to do is to swim.
Really? Same.
Oh, good. Awesome. I wish I was a better swimmer, but I
Oh,
swim. It
same.
brings me a lot of
Yeah.
peace and joy. And my favorite sport to watch is actually track and field,
Interesting.
especially track.
It's getting a lot of momentum.
I'm
Yeah.
not a track athlete, never been. I don't really have a strong sport gene in my body. I grew up dancing, which is a sport, but a different type. But I love watching runners and sprinters. It's just so fascinating.
We have a lot in common. And I'm glad we're doing this episode because this is how I'm learning. I grew up dancing as well. I have another quick question, and this is
Yeah.
more to emerging founders or investors, I guess, that are getting into the space. Do you have advice or top tip for either or?
For founders, I would say know your consumer, know your user, and obsess them. Be maniacally consumer centric. And your consumer can be anybody. It can be a business, it can be the government, it can be women, it can be men, it doesn't matter, but know who that is and really deeply obsess them.
And the last question, this is probably something rather counterintuitive that you might have seen in the media space or media investments. Is there one thing that you would find that counterintuitive?
I think people think media is expensive, but I think with the innovations and disruptions we're seeing in media, it's actually more cost effective and effective than people think.
Interesting. I wish you were in some of the conversations we're having with prospective brands. I absolutely agree.
I'm
I,
sure.
I think it depends on the approach, right? Altogether. And there's so many
For sure.
seasonalities and strategies you can take to
Yeah,
optimize the cost. Yeah, it's a very good one.
for sure. Maybe to reframe, it can be expensive, but I think to your point, if you can be thoughtful, if you can strategize in the right way, if you can be creative in the way media for growth is, I think you can use media very effectively and very cost effectively.
I completely agree. Singari, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I've learned a ton.
Likewise.
Now I know we have even more things in common, and I'm excited about the new journey.
Absolutely, Diana. Thank you. I am too. And I'm so excited. I know it took a couple of months to get me on here, but I feel like the timing is perfect. And I'm looking forward to getting to know you even more.
Me too. Thanks so much, Singari. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on the Media for Growth podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, leave a review, follow the pod, and subscribe at mediaforgrowth.com.